Thank you for listening to this special broadcast here at the Court of Public Opinion. We're going to address a lot of important topics and a speaking event here after this. Thank you for taking time to listen to the Court of Public Opinion, this special series that we're going to do part 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is a series in which I hope it helps inform you, educate you, and also help keep you aware on the issues of trafficking. This is part 1, discussing sex trafficking in your community. Hi and welcome. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Jennifer Tartaglione. I'm the granddaughter of the attorney for the Pittsburgh Police. My grandfather served as an attorney for the Pittsburgh Police between 1950 and 1976. I know this is such an important topic to those in my community. Let's start there. I sense I have an obligation, as much as how important, on principle, the topic on child abuse in every home and every family. You've probably heard on the news about reports back in the 1970s. It was Adam Walsh, and today there are cases of child abuse that range from what's happening in your community to what's on TV to what's happening globally. I have to look at what's going on locally to understand the bigger issue. It's hard to look at this broad number when I think of the rate of increase of child abuse, because it can range from neglect to severe abuse and all forms of it. Some people say they identify that the child abuse is a symptom of a bigger problem. Well, that's obvious, because when you look at the numbers and statistics of missing children, and then you look at in comparison to child abuse, they seem to have similarities, but not every situation is the same. But overall, the epidemic of child abuse would grab anyone's attention, especially because when you're thinking about children, you think about safety, about holding a child in your arms, immediately you become protective. It's natural. For a mother, that would be the natural inclination. For a father, the need to be protective also comes naturally. So anything outside of that, to me, is what I find the primal instincts to protect the home. They often talked about the hunter and the gatherer. The hunter being the man, he hunts, and then, in this case, can hunt for a job. You often hear it that way. Or the mother, who she gathers the children and she protects them under her wing. These are the kind of things I think about when I think about a family. Protective, wanting to keep your home safe. They often refer to nesting. When a mother is preparing to have a child, she's nesting. She's ready to give birth, nesting. These are words you use. So when I think of the concerns that a mom or dad might have regarding what's going on in the community, and you hear a report, and in the 80s you didn't hear of the increase of teachers and sexual abuse cases. For teachers, I'm sure this is a compromising situation, because you might work with colleagues who have some issues when it comes to their relationship with children. Therapists, you've often shared with me about the critical parent. Some kids have this kind of relationship with a parent. It's either there's favoritism or sibling rivalry. All these other factors I take into consideration. But even that doesn't even arrive to the occasion when we look at child abuse. How do we go from these concerns, those factors, to absolute blatant child abuse? Because we know problems don't start when a report occurs, a child abuse. There might be concerns that might have set the parents up, and then they end up in a situation where they're accused of abuse. So to me, you have to get through all these other things, and you have to kind of go through this haze or this fog to actually discuss the issues of child abuse. You know, we grew up, we had this idea that it was what we saw on TV. We know it doesn't look like that. Nowadays, parents wonder if they're going to be accused of child abuse just for correcting their children. To me, these are concerns that I would want to know about. I'm not a parent, so I can't possibly appreciate what a parent might go through and some of the ups and downs of being a parent and the concerns. But one thing, I grew up with a family from the World War II generation where correcting your children came naturally. I know. I sat there with my dad, and he told me one day, he goes, well, if you want to get a paddle, you'll have to hand me what looks today as a frat boy's paddle. And he told me to paint my paddle. He never used it. In fact, I often talked to my dad when I was younger. And he said, I hope I never have to use a paddle. And I was hoping so too. Not that I didn't get, a crack on the rear end, because I did. And thank God for correction, because I learned right away that I wasn't going to cross my dad. And I respect my dad for that. My father was a captain in the Marine Corps. And, if I had kids, I probably would understand the concerns parents had. But I always, always understood why my parents had the concerns they did. Because back in the 70s, it was a lot different of a period, in which today, 30, 40 years later, I recognize that parents have all kinds of concerns. I mean, with more computers, you have all kinds of other unexpected concerns that you didn't have in the 70s. Like, do I leave my kids alone with a computer? Of course, that doesn't seem like a big problem. But by today's standards, your kids can log on and end up talking to somebody that is disguising themselves to be something they're not. So obviously, we've had this conversation. I had the same conversation in 2000. We're having the same conversation in 2017. 17 years later, over 20 years ago, when the introduction of the internet in 1997, to me, I wasn't ready for all this. But slowly but surely, we got conditioned to accept Facebook, Twitter, and we forgot what was going on at home. So I recognize that more and more since I have found the words and a way to address the concerns in our community. If you look around you, many people don't even know who their neighbors are. And that's not anyone personally at fault for that. It just happens over a period of time. Like anything, it doesn't start when you recognize it. It may have started long before then. I was sharing with a friend that in 1997, it was foreign to get on the chat site. Not everybody that I knew had a chat site avatar. I didn't even know what it was. But as soon as, over a period of time, we migrated to Facebook after we checked out a few other social sites. And even then, I knew right away I didn't want to be involved in it, and I was hooked. So, internet addiction is a reality for everyone. Anything, if you use it too much, they say abuse is a misuse of a person, place, and thing. So nowadays it can be internet addiction. And we recognize that if we're not honest with ourselves and we don't know when to unplug and we just shut off our brain and we let everything else take over, we have no control over our behavior, much less than those who don't recognize that you have to recognize these things, if used improperly, can be abused, and left in the right hands, it could be useful. Left in the wrong hands, it could be dangerous and destructive. But when did we come to the point when we understood that a child abuse, once it's reported, it has been going on for a while? It usually finally, after being reported, is finally being reported. It usually takes a number of situations, and this is statistically true. Usually, again, child abuse doesn't start the day it was reported. Oftentimes people blame the person that reported it. Actually, it's probably going on a lot longer. That's usually common. The same statistics can apply with domestic violence. Usually, it doesn't start with hitting. It started way back. So anyone that wants to get into arguing whether a whistleblower said something or not, it's been going on a lot longer. You know what I mean? This is common knowledge. It's when it gets reported, it may be just in time before it gets so out of hand. And I know this because my friend who worked for Sarah Weck, she was working at the medical examiner's office, had told me about how reporting worked. I didn't really know. I didn't actually take the time to even pay attention. I actually didn't want to know, honestly. I was trying to pretend that I didn't see what I seen. But in 2002, one night we were talking over at her apartment. She had worked for the coroner's office as a student, and she told me why it's important to report. And I didn't really hear it this way ever until that night. She says the reason why you have to report it is because if you don't recognize the problem, it may be, by the time you don't recognize the problem, it may be too late. Meaning, if you don't recognize there's a problem, it's not that the problem doesn't exist. It's just you have to identify that this is a problem. You would have been talking about it to begin with. And at that time, I was just a server. I was waiting tables. I didn't even think twice about it. I just mentioned it to her, and she told me, you need to report this. I was like, I'm not that kind of person. I don't want to report this. I don't want to lose my job. And that's exactly what most people think of when you report something, because typically what the police officer said to us many times over, and many of the ones that I've talked to over the course of my lifetime, why didn't you report this sooner? Why didn't you get that in paperwork? Why didn't you go down to the judge? Why didn't you talk to this? And we did. We finally got it. To me, it was because I wanted to pretend. Part of me wanted to be in denial. Not because I wanted to, but I wanted to stay there. Because I didn't want to deal with the real problem that was in front of me. And that was the reporting process. Because obviously for a lot of people, I don't know about any of you, but tattling on your friends and things like that, we've heard this before. And I actually found an article by the Guardian Angels in New York that came back around to deal with the issues of bullying. They too agree that there was extensive work dealing with gang violence, abuse, and why it is that kids don't report, because of the very thing called tattling, ratting people out. And I didn't recognize how serious this issue was and how common it is that you often hear, why did you not rat people out? Or why did you rat that one out? Why did you say this when you didn't have to say anything? And the thing is, that is the reason why people don't report it. And that is one of the big issues about reporting something. Because I was the same way. Many of you understand why you have to have documentation. Because everything seems to end up in court. But that's why we want to avoid a lot of that. That's why we discuss these things, so it doesn't have to go to court. We want to talk about prevention and awareness so that you can be aware, so that if this happens, you catch it before it gets to the point that you have to deal with a report. Why? Well, you alert the people around you. Say, our community is taking steps to prevent child abuse. More awareness projects means it may not have to come to that police report. I know this because it worked in the 80s and it will work today. And it's called this block parent program, one in which I don't know how it disappeared. But let me say this. Taking an active approach, and me taking this opportunity, any of you who've grown up around people who are family or friends that worked in law enforcement, or relatives that worked at that capacity, you have a working knowledge. It's like we were born this way. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, we were born this way. And the thing is that one of the things that being born this way is that when you're born, growing up with a grandfather who was an attorney for the Pittsburgh Police, I was born this way. I was born to work in the legal field. I didn't recognize that, but everyone said I'd make a fantastic lawyer. But I didn't really want to commit myself to college, okay? Honestly, I like hanging out with you guys much better. We were born this way. So, obviously, one of the things that I know that everyone has an understanding about, this issue, this big issue, one in which I call the elephant in the room that everyone's, you don't want to know who the elephant is, and the elephant being child abuse is a scary topic. And the more we talk about it, the more I think our guard is going to come down. I want people to get comfortable with themselves, to understand that this is an issue that was just as much important to us in 1982, and just like in 1992 and in 2017. I recognize that families have changed. The rules have changed. A lot of people now, back in 1981, it was not as common to see divorced parents, believe it or not. It's more common now. I didn't think there was a big conditioning of that as well. We've come to accept these things, that they come and you go through it and then you move forward. Unfortunately, it's not a bad thing that people have come to this realization that families don't often stay together. And why are those issues? Because I think outside of the home, maybe there are other factors. I get it. I mean, I heard one time, and I am divorced, so my ex-husband once told me he didn't believe in divorce. I don't believe in divorce either, but I don't believe people should stay together. And one of the things same thing I would say is true. I'm not going to stick around, or you shouldn't have to stick around, or you shouldn't stick around the issue of child abuse. I just don't know what else to say. It's on my heart. It's been that big of a concern for me, or I wouldn't take the time to talk about the different situations that people are put in, or the compromising situations I've often heard. I've heard reports. You watch the news. Sometimes I just think, shut it off. Maybe it'll just go away. I mean, really. So back to the concerns I had growing up as a little girl and into my teen years. I didn't really understand. All I knew is I saw polyclass plastered all over the news. And at the time, that story, and as well the Atlanta murders, the children that were murdered in Atlanta. These were so important to me because I looked at Polly Klaas like she was really kind of she was only a couple years younger than me. And I remember climbing down this hill, well, not climbing, but like kind of running down the hill more or less. And I couldn't get her picture out of my mind. You know, the milk cartons back then and what we do today are far different. But the things that work then work today. And I'm hoping that with more cooperation and those people who want to see these great projects come back to life here in Pennsylvania by supporting H.R. 951, the extension of the child abuse and that in being compensation for families. And it's a little bit more elaborate. I'm probably not going to touch on all of it today, but if you want more information, I have a YouTube channel. Please go there because there's so much information. I list a lot of it so that you don't have to do all the hard homework, because a lot of this is a very touchy topic, and we want to get past the touchy project to tell you the real numbers are alarming, because I know it's just not touching my community here in the greater Pittsburgh area, but it's beyond, because you can watch the news, you know. Now you have social media. You can see it on the news feed. It might not be posted there, but you'll see it. But if you turn on the TV, any of you still have the basic channels of well, now it's basic cable. It used to be bunny ears, so we couldn't even get channel 2, 4, 6. But today, you can turn on the news, and I bet you there's been a case reported of child abuse. In fact, recently, there was a case reported in Arkansas. A young couple, their little baby, a newborn, was left in a cage, from what I understand, if I've got the story correct, and there were rat bites all over this newborn. And then there was a couple other stories, and you've seen the epic crimes increase in daycare workers, where children were left in the care of a daycare provider, and they catch a video of the nanny or daycare provider abusing an 8-month-old. And then another story I just read today on mommypage.com, where a woman came home after picking up her daughter from the daycare center and found sores all through her mouth, and the little baby had herpes. The baby wasn't born with that. And they knew that one of the daycare workers had herpes, genital herpes. So I think you can pretty much get the picture of what's going on here. I sit here and I stand here, or I want to wrap my arms around those parents that felt the same way that some of us felt in 1985. When I talk about the daycare experience, I am so concerned that parents would pay that kind of money. You know, the one thing I can say is, while I'm born that way to do law, I never got a degree. I waited tables. I served in the military for a very short time. I had an injury, and any ambition I had to work in law enforcement was pretty much eviscerated once I had this handicap. There were so many setbacks I couldn't do it. That was the whole reason I signed up to be in the services, to become a Pittsburgh police officer. As a female police officer, I knew this is what I was destined to do. But that didn't happen. So I decided I'd get a radio mic and talk and talk and talk and talk. But I'm going to talk some of your ears off about child abuse. It's so hard to tell you now, looking back, but how brave I was at 14 years old. I didn't understand what I was walking into that day. And there was a daycare center in 1985 that was commonly known as Glenmore Academy in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Actually, in Dormont. What made this story so important because the perpetrator who was charged has since died over 2.5 months ago. It's really hard to talk to you all about how serious this day was for me because I realized that I didn't know what I was walking into until I got there and I knocked on the door and I found out that my sisters were left there. And it wasn't because I was looking just for the fact of finding out where my sisters were, but I needed to know if they were safe. And I was 14 years old. Most people said, thank me and congratulate me and said, you did a good thing. But initially it was because ultimately those were my sisters and I needed to know if they're okay. For 2 weeks up to that point, they were not home. And I was concerned. I was pacing the floor. I didn't exactly have a good school year that year as well. So I didn't know how, if anyone would listen to me. And that's been common in my life, is that oftentimes people play things down or they downplay the concerns. And I'm here to say that if you have to downplay your concerns, that concerns me, by the way. Because again, I tell you, as a person who knew enough about stories like Polly Klaas and the Atlanta murders, at that time I understood as an 11-year-old that this is serious. I didn't want to see kids my age or kids younger than me end up dead. And that's, to me, at 11 years old, I got that message. It was such an issue for me at 11. And it hit me very hard. And I believe at that time I was in 4th grade. And I remember going down that hill that day. I couldn't get Polly Klaas's face out of my mind. It's not surprising that I actually got to know in 2009 Mark Lunsford after the Jessica Lunsford case. And I actually, for a short time, wanted to do something, but I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. But I know by the time I got to the point, I had to go through a lot. When I told you I couldn't become a Pittsburgh police officer, but I decided to become a radio host, this is what I was trying to do. I was trying to put this thing together called XNYC Mobile because I really felt like there was a communication breakdown on 9/11, and a lot of the missing people that could not be found was due to missing persons cases. And of course, now we know because of the events that occurred, but in those initial hours, a lot of people were posting pictures of their missing loved ones. And looking at today, when you heard the story in Manchester, same thing. How did they account for all these people so quickly? Because I do know that missing persons is probably the most important concern when a national tragedy or an event happens, that you want to get their pictures out. And to me, one of the most important things about having a database is that you know that we're going to be able to find a way to reach out to those families and parents that are trying to grasp the fact that their children have been missing. And I just recently heard another story in Washington, D.C., that there have been girls that have been missing, and we still haven't heard really the full story about that. And it's only been in the last month. So obviously these are really important cases. Each missing person case to me matters because I look at how many people want to know more about how to solve these unsolved mysteries. And you have to do your great detective work. And I'm not here to say that, it doesn't take somebody to go to police academy to add up what's going on. In some cases, you see that when you hear about a report in the case, the one that comes to mind, of course, is Polly Klaas. I believe started this journey. Within myself, I knew this is what I needed to know. I need to know. And I followed more classic ever since. I've Just that important. But for me, I did not expect to walk in on what I saw that day. And I didn't really see anything, but it's not what I seen, it's what I heard. Years later, I found out the whole story came out in a newspaper here. It was called the Pittsburgh Press at the time. And it was, they finally made, I'm sorry, they finally went through the court. There were some representatives, I believe, that were involved in children's CYS, and I believe they represented some members of my family at the time. I'm not quite sure. I don't know the full story of that. But initially, the whole reason we started here and why we end here is because of what happened that day. There was court involvement. There were a lot of people involved at that moment. I know it all started and ended somewhere, and it all ended for me a couple weeks ago when I went down to Glenmore Academy. I later found out that the perpetrator, had passed away. He was much older at this point, and he did die. And he did do court time. He did do time in jail as after court. So I didn't have this lengthy, awesome career I wanted. I got something totally different. When I say families suffer, I'm not kidding you. We suffered in silence. People weren't telling us the whole story. And the problem is I had relatives and family that didn't know the whole story, and neither did we. And we were trying to put the pieces back together and trying to better understand. And I knew that there was so much missing information that was not told to us. And my caseworker at the time when I was a kid passed away. So the only better way I could do is acknowledge that Erica, the program in which we're trying to create, was an outreach. And I realized it's going to change a lot more. Even now, we're in the process of making major changes to this program. It's not going to be called Erica's House after this, as you know. We have to make the initial changes because I realized that we identify with what Erica did because I know we're beyond that point now. We're looking at a larger, bigger, it's much bigger, but it's more condensed because I know not only it's the reporting process, it's education, why people need to be aware before it even happens. Why do you have to wait till an assault case is reported? Because that's usually, but most people, that's how they respond. And they, all they need is to know they've been accepted and they belong, to know that, wow, their concerns matter. Yes, they do. So I'm thinking about that 11-year-old that I was and 11-year-old today. If this is important to you, please, what you have to say matters. Whether you're 10 or 11, you see a missing persons report on the news, 11-year-olds are provoked. I was. What I didn't know is at 14 years old, I walked in on that day at a daycare center and I found what I believe today was the reason he was prosecuted, not because of my story, but because somebody finally reported it. Again, it goes back to why didn't somebody step in sooner? Usually, again, if it hadn't been for that report, it may have prevented a crime. The crime was already going on. It was already in progress, as they say. So while I didn't go to police academy, I had some injuries and I didn't have to become a law enforcement. Again, say, I was born this way. I know a lot of people think, well, how did you know all this? I don't really know, honestly. I was born this way. And I wasn't born a lawyer, but I was born this way. I like to think that I have a law degree or get honorary degree. That would be great. Because it's always good to have a piece of paper that has a few letters behind your name. Maybe they'll take me more serious. Or if I had a police academy degree, or if all these things that I did in my life that made me, puff me up, but it didn't happen like that. But I was born this way, okay? So for anyone that has any concerns about whether you have some issues, whether, genetic disposition for being more male than female, but you have those other concerns of gender confusion, I'm here to tell you, we were confused too. We were really confused. We didn't know what to identify with what. Because I'm going to tell you, it helps a lot when people discuss the concerns that all of us might have. about raising children, about what's going on from the time you conceive to the time you have that child, and also the concerns that come after that, because your parents are like pacing the floor saying, I don't know if I want to continue having a family because I'm concerned about these things. These are legitimate concerns that parents have talked about. They don't understand how to adapt to a world that is more accepting, and I don't know that it is more accepting. I just think that there are more people that don't know how to talk about the concerns they have when it comes to raising children. And when I told you earlier about these child abuse reports and what I found on mommypage.com, I recognize that while I might not be a mother, I haven't had children of my own, I might not be a police officer, but something you are born with is being that internal instinct for sensing danger. That mother was concerned about her little baby, if you read the article, because she knew that there was blisters around her little infant's mouth. This baby wasn't born with this condition. But one thing a mother does sense is danger, or something's not right. And when I tell you that you're born with that nature, while I might not be born with a law degree in my hand, because I wasn't, I certainly deserve it, believe me. It would be really nice if somebody was really nice enough to give me a law degree. But see, handing somebody a law degree came with great suffering. And I know there are parents that are struggling and they are suffering. They don't know what happened to their kids. They don't know if that case is going to be solved. But I will say this, you look back and usually abuse doesn't start the day it was reported. It's a lot easier to look back at some of the things that were going on now when I think about that case. And luckily for us, our case was solved. I mean, it didn't come with a lot of pain and suffering. There were a lot of things that we had to confront. I never was ready to confront, concerns I never ever thought I'd understand. Even as an adult, I still don't understand it. But I know what we walked in on that day, and I know how important this is, because if it wasn't for the Blue Campaign or programs like this, I don't know that we could be sitting here doing any kind of community outreach and educating our community, our neighbor. Please start talking to each other. Get past your opinions of each other. You'd be surprised how much you're going to like your neighbors around you. There's a lot of people that talk about people, but they don't even know who they are. They're just looking overall that this person judged me, or they don't like my Facebook post, or they blew up the notifications. Good. At least you have something to talk about. Maybe you said something really off the wall on Facebook. But you got to start somewhere. Say, listen, I'm a big enough person to recognize, well, I might have some concerns, and I might not understand the whole dynamic when it comes to social media. And sometimes we need to take a break from our social life and just take a time out to unplug. But you want to be there to discuss these things with your kids. You want to be able to have an opportunity to discuss the things that matter to them. Don't let the computer babysit them, just like back in the 80s. They told us, don't let MTV babysit. That was a bad idea, by the way, okay? I remember watching Benny Hill one night, and it went from Benny Hill to Saturday Night Live to MTV. It was just a short amount of time, because we didn't even have cable then. And I remember the day cable came into our house. That was the only way that many of us went to bed at night. Because I grew up at the time where you heard the national anthem at midnight. That meant you were not sleeping. You were supposed to be in bed like 2 hours ago. That was usually an indication we were up way too late. So when we talk about the issues that concern our community, the first thing I'm going to say is child abuse. Again, I've heard a lot of things about why people don't report it. It's usually because they've been labeled something. They've been labeled a rat. Well, I'm here to say anybody that I've known that's ever been in a gang, or looking at some of the information articles I will list below so that you have enough information to gather on your own. I did a lot of hard work on this topic. This is not an easy topic to tackle. But I look at some of the leaders and the people that call themselves leaders. To me, I don't look at the national leaders as much as I look at what's going on locally. I want to know what's going on in our community first, like in our area, our streets, the things that we can identify. Do we have situational awareness? Are we putting our peripherals and our blindfolds on purposely because we don't want to deal with it? Because I'm telling you, that's a bad idea. Stop pretending that this problem doesn't exist. The problem exists, it's just going ignored. And the only way we're going to be able to open up this dialogue with somebody down the street, whether you know that guy that goes to the gas station, you know these people by name, you probably had several times over to talk to them about things that might concern you. I heard today from a former retired teacher about the story about a girl down the street who was murdered. Her boyfriend sat there in her apartment waiting for her, and he shot her point blank. I didn't even know about that had it not been for my neighbor telling me that story. That's how important it is to connect with our neighbors. So everything about what we're trying to accomplish here on this, with this community project, this community outreach and the Blue Ribbon Campaign, is create a model where we can talk about it. I mean, do you have to organize a big formal group? Do we have to go through the formalities? Maybe. I don't know. I just know this, it starts here. And whether it's a project, whatever we label it, it is what it is. It's an opportunity for us to open up a way to discuss it. Do I have to be the granddaughter of the attorney for the Pittsburgh Police who, my grandfather passed away in 1976 to discuss this? No, of course not. But I just think some people say, I want to know if these people are legit. I want to know if they're real. Well, I'm going to tell you, you can do your homework. I give you opportunity after opportunity. Find out who I am. Because it's not who I am, it's the message. Now, I do have an obligation to say this. I don't want to purposely misrepresent anybody. So that's why I'm keeping it very specific to the cases that you do hear about, the ones that have gone to court. I can't discuss cases that haven't gone to court. It's hard for me because that's where it gets tricky, because I do understand this much. I was born this way with maybe not a law degree, but common sense. I can't report on things I don't know about. I can't discuss things that I don't know about, but I can discuss what we have experienced regarding the case of child abuse. When a parent reports child abuse as a result of being in a daycare, or a school counselor calling home and finding out why the kids aren't coming to school, because over a period of time, this is a pattern. And you got kids that are always going to try to test the limits. I was one of those kids. What I wasn't aware of is how seriously scary it is when you don't have your parents at home to talk about these things. And there was a lot of things that needed to be addressed that weren't addressed. I mean, it took me a long time to really kind of take those, I would say, be able to be comfortable enough to discuss it, because it took me a long time to have the communication skills to discuss it. I didn't have them. I learned slowly but surely. I had to find the courage to do it. It takes a lot to get behind a microphone and talk about it. It would be a lot easier to say that, well, I didn't become a cop and I wanted to be a radio host, or I wanted to do this with my life. A lot of times I grew up thinking, who would ever report about stuff like this? How do they find the bravery? How do they find the strength? I don't know. We just grow up at some point. And the hardest moments in this was I had to learn to grow up and accept the fact that this is a reality in the world in which I was growing up in. And most of my friends, while they may not have been personally affected by my case, many people were. And that day in that courtroom, I saw people I'd never seen in 20 years. My aunt, relatives, family. And I remember that day. And I remember where it started, and I know where it ended. For me, it ended something 3.5 weeks ago. Or actually, I'm sorry, 3. Actually look into whatever happened of this particular case that I encountered in 1985. I learned that, in fact, the person that was prosecuted for the abuse of this individual, who was a 4-year little boy at the time, who is now 36, now 37, I recognized that this was still important to me. And when I heard the whole story, that 4-year little boy, now then 36 years old, wanted to find out more information. And he was there a couple days prior to me being there. I realized we were on the same path. Somebody reported it to save that little boy's life because he's 36 years old. I don't know what happened to him. I would love to meet this young man so much. Because when I followed the story in 1986 and found out that the court case, in fact, did favor the victim, being a 4-year-old little boy at the time, I think I was really thankful that justice did prevail eventually. I know a lot of people don't hear about these cases because you have to follow the story to understand. I followed the story. I waited and waited. In fact, but by the time I got to the location where this event actually occurred, I got so much more than just a story. But it filled in a lot of information. I told you there was a lot of missing information, and I got a better idea of what happened. It was so amazing because I was shaken. I did not want to go there, but I had to make a way. I had to go over there to discuss this. I had to know what happened to this little boy. I needed to know. This happened in my community. That's why I know it's a community thing. As much as people talk about what's going on nationally, it has to start in the community. Because if we can learn to trust each other and talk about the things that matter in our community, we're going to look at bus service a lot different. We're going to look at reporting a lot different. We're going to talk about the things that matter to us a lot differently. Because we're okay with ourselves enough to say, hey, listen, I am big enough of a person to know if we need to report it, we need to report it. I can't get into explaining why people do what they do. I just know initially, if it hadn't been for the person reported that 4-year-old boy, I don't know what would have happened to him. Somebody reported it. I was 14 years old. I didn't even understand that process. Over time, as I grew up, I realized that process existed and it's important and why it serves the purpose it did. And if it hadn't been for the brave individuals that made that phone call or interceded in behalf of that little boy, I don't know that we would be able to sit here and tell you that there is sort of a happy ending to this. And what's even more amazing about this is that we got the ear of the representatives and they're starting to pay attention because of particular cases like this. So supporting H.R. 951 means extending the age limits where they can, in fact, I think, file civilly regarding a case, in this case, a case that happened in 1986, and now since he's deceased, that they would be allowed to hear their case again in court, but in a different facet. I hope all of you understand that this is not like retrying the case because the case was already tried in 1986. But to me, when the representatives started to listen to what we were saying, I had to put this video and audio together so that this would give them the time they needed to discuss this with other representatives. And because we've been able to have, we've taken a lot of time to discuss it, and we will keep talking about it. Because the more we talk about it, more we understand. While I might not have been born with a law degree in my hand, there are some things I was born with. One of the great things I can say as we wrap this up is that I only have a very short memory of my grandfather, but everything I found out that he stood for, principles and things that I hope I can at least be that and more the people in my community today. I might not be whatever all these people had, but I know this. If any of you ever grew up with a family with a legacy, I want to leave behind a legacy that I stepped up where my grandfather couldn't because he had passed away. I know that we have relatives, and there's some people that mean a lot to us. And I have to tell you, the privilege of meeting my grandfather's secretary coming home from working at a law office of all things in 1989. And that's what started this. Because to me, I wasn't just looking for the truth. I wanted to see justice served. And to me, my ambition was to become a judge ever since I was a little girl. I wanted to be a police officer and a judge. Those are the two very important things. Well, it may not have happened exactly that way, but I did find a career in radio. And I do operate a show called The Court of Public Opinion. So I'm happy with it. But the more important issue is addressing the issue of child abuse. from the time it was reported to the cases, the type of cases. Because that, to me, again, child abuse is not just, you can't like look at every case the same. They might have similarities. And that's why I know how important this is to a mom or a dad. Somebody has gone through the difficult process of trying to accept what happened to their child. This is very, very difficult. For me, it took me a long time to get to the point where I can talk about it. And we need a lot of therapy, okay? I don't hold any anger towards any of the people that were involved, believe it or not. It took me a long time to outgrow it and grow up and mature and realize that there are people with problems, and I have to be able to accept the fact that while there are problems, I have to know how to address it. And the only antidote to that is try to be a voice about prevention, about awareness. Because I could go into an assembly, I could talk to teachers, I could talk to parents, but honestly, I don't know what's going on in their lives. But overall, these are some of the concerns that some of the people in our community have. They want to hear it. They want to hear it all the time. It's very reassuring to know that there are people that support parents and families. They don't want the risk losing their children because of the way they correct their children. And there are extremes. Right? So we discuss disciplinary issues. Why is it that parents can't discipline their kids? Because of the issue of child abuse. And until we understand the issue of child abuse and how oftentimes it's used to manipulate parents and control them, that in fact they can't correct their children because they don't want to go down this road of child abuse. The problem is the parents still in a position, they have a legal responsibility over their children. They're held to that standard. If their children are misbehaving, a lot of times in some cases, what it used to be is the parents were in trouble. And that hasn't changed much. They want us to believe that, correcting your children is child abuse. It's not how it is. We're talking about real sexual abuse cases where some adult is violating their child in a way they're not supposed to. Correcting children and disciplining children are one thing. Punishing and abusing children is a totally different thing. I think once we understand that abusing and punishing children is defined by misuse of something or someone or a thing. Misuse. Once you understand the definition of abuse, it's a lot easier to grasp that parents, yes, they do correct their kids. Are they misusing that authority? Well, that's when we get into the discussion and we discuss child abuse. Because I can't go down that road. All these parents are going to walk away with a guilt complex because they say, well, I corrected my child and I don't know what to say, but now I'm going to be thrown into this. That's that gray area, that confusion. I'm going to clearly state to you, anyone that has children or parents, you have to correct your children. And the whole idea of correcting your children, I think the reason we have the problems we do is because there have been so much emphasis that parents would be in trouble. They would lose their children for correcting their children. That is the wrong message. It is the parents' responsibility. And the more parents stick together and they discuss these things, they realize that correcting in your children is important. It prevents crimes down the road. It prevents these kids to go to that dark alley and shoot up or go cop for drugs. That's the whole reason you get that correction in while you can. Or you're going to end up with what we have today, an opioid addiction epidemic. See, it's really easy to sit there and say we're all about looking out for the family and the community. But you got to start where the problem is. And it doesn't have to end up in an opioid addiction. Or don't have to be copping for drugs. You got to deal with correction at home. And it starts there. And that was something I learned at a very early age. I have to tell you, I did not want to paint that paddle. And I was thanking God that he never used it. But I know what it is to get a nice swat on you know what. And thank God. I don't know how my dad got through that because he told me, as I got older, he's like, that was the hardest day. He didn't forget it. I didn't remember. All I remember is getting that swat. But I do remember that talk. And I thank God that my dad was smart enough to correct me because I had much more respect for my dad. Because I wasn't going to do it again, more or less. You know what I mean? I don't have a drug problem either. And I believe it's because my dad corrected me. Because he did. I didn't want to ever go through that again. I promise you that. And I don't want to ever have to go through that. I don't like correction any more than anybody else, but it's vital at a young age because it prevents crimes down the road. Believe me, there are a lot of people today that are sitting in jail cells wishing their parents sat them down and had that talk, the kind of talk where you're gonna come up with your own form of discipline. And luckily it never came to that, but some of you wouldn't want to be in some of these programs, youth programs, where they rehab kids because they don't have parents to correct them. I mean, going to an orphans program or group home program is not the way of the future for us. We want to bring it back to the family because I think if you understand why initially moms and dads and why the divorce rate has been high, I can't get into all that. I can tell you the absence of a father or absence of a mother leaves this gaping wound open, and anyone can fill that void and hurt kids. And that's why I think parents who really care about their kids, or teachers, or people that have been through these circumstances, they can identify with these things. It's like, yeah, I'm a teacher. I don't want this in my classroom. I don't want this in my community. It matters to me how these kids are affected by the concerns. Yes, there are disciplinary issues, but overall, we care about what happens in our community. No, we cannot support abusing children or misuse of that authority because it's happening. It's happening in schools now, throughout school districts throughout the United States. It's happening now in police academies or police departments because you heard a report in Ohio. Mayors have been arrested. So obviously, I sense this is that important. While I might not have the law enforcement background, I was born with one thing, with that family unit that has been broken up due to reports and all the things that occurred during that period, that my family had been broken ever since. If I could say one thing to my mom or dad or the people around me, no one wanted to come home that day and find the things out that I found out. I would trade places with anybody if it would have meant my whole life would have been altogether different, but that is not how it happened. And maybe sometimes when you look back, you say, thank God for our problems, because I thank God every day that we had a way out of this. I cannot imagine living that way and without somebody interceding for us. And I think the same goes is that when you think of reporting, I thank God that day that we didn't have to stick around for what could have been much worse. That's why I say to you now, child abuse doesn't start the day it's reported. So you can just cut yourself some slack if you're one of those people who have reported cases or witnessed it. Believe me, it's not going to all hinge on you. In some cases it may, but overall, a lot of people are aware of child abuse. They don't report it. That's the problem. It's underreported. And that concerns me. So, do we want to raise a bunch of tattletales? No. But we do not want to ever fit that kind of concern into that category. You got to talk about it. You have to feel comfortable enough to talk about it. Or parents walk around wounded and they can't discuss it and they're not allowing themselves to discuss it. Or maybe it's, again, goes back to that thing where people put their peripherals on and they just look things straightforward, and they just have narrow mind thinking. You can't be. You have to have situational awareness on this issue. So I'm going to close it with this. I hope what I've been able to do is offer a more light approach about this, but still stick to the topics, because I don't want to entertain you with information that is not going to be helpful, number one. But I also want to give you information and give you, try to do it as sensitively as I can. These are sensitive topics. I don't agree with anyone on whether I should ignore this report or should I not say anything. No, that's it. We're beyond this point, is what I'm saying. We need to talk about it. But we have to do it in a way that's safe, and we got to do it in a public. That's why I believe what we discuss in the public does matter, because we don't want this going on in our home. Anyone smart enough that has ever been a victim of abuse or witnessed it or survived it, and years later, you want to know that you left behind a better legacy than what you may have encountered. And that's why this turnaround is real. That's why the Blue campaign outreach matters to me. It should matter to my neighbor. It should matter to people around me who know maybe we have something we can share in common. There is, and that's where I end it. because where most of you will pick up is you're going to be able to share stories. You're going to be able to open up to people in your community in a way you haven't opened up. You're going to be able to talk to teachers on a real level about what it is to discipline. And this is how people grow. This is how families get better. This is how families recover. And all of a sudden, this trust is built where it wasn't before. Or you share a story, like I've known this happened many times, but it just seems like we go through our lives. And then I ran into girls I didn't know in high school, and they said, "Why didn't you tell us about this sooner?" I was like, wow, how cathartic. I didn't want to, believe it or not. So I know, while we might not be born with all these extra special abilities, although I'd like to think I was, I know we're born to live, we're born to grow, we're going to recover, we're going to have our ups and downs, we're going to have our difficulties. I know that a lot of us need to know that we can come to others about our concerns. And instead of worried about what people think of me or whether gender issue or gender confusion issue, it's more about what's going on within each of us. Because, there's a human side to every part of this story that is hard to ignore. I hate the idea that anyone would be confused about their gender. That really bothers me. I hate the idea of knowing that somebody's in that conflict without being able to communicate that. I hope that we can communicate it. I don't know the issue per se, but I'd like to try. It hurts me that somebody has been through this. And I don't, set my religious views aside or your religious views aside, but it concerns me that somebody doesn't feel accepted or loved or feels judged. That's bothersome to me. So that's why we do this, because I think more than just talking about the stories that we see on the news, like I did the day I discovered what this story meant to me, and stories like that even today. And why do we encourage people to talk about it? Because I want to be able to open up this platform in a way that will be a unique way to reach out to people. This is not about condemning and demonizing anybody, but believe it or not, it's about talking about the facts. That we can prevent it from happening for that young mother or that young single dad who recognizes there's concerns in his community, but he doesn't identify with it. And if you feel safe enough that you can feel at least comfortable enough to open up a discussion, which I offer that in a chat site. But again, that we're as much trying to keep each other sharpened so that we are aware of what's going on. So we don't just try to ignore the things that are happening around us, because most of you have kids. Well, I don't. I know some of you do. So hopefully we're the best mouthpiece possible. I could probably say I was born that way with that. But, I use my title for a reason so that I can help you. Because maybe it will make a difference. Maybe it will make a difference that I have a family that worked in law enforcement at that capacity, that can work with police officers, that can work with community members. To me, I'd pull myself out of the way right now if it means that it's going to open up that dialogue between members of the community and the police department and bring that close-knit back to our communities. If we can do one thing, we haven't had that in a long time. I grew up this way. As I told you earlier, so we started where I'm going to end it, is that my family grew up in World War II. So for me, it matters that people have that close-knit community. And yes, correcting your children's part of it. I know you don't have to feel bad about it. But we need to know where the laws are, and that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to change the definition of child abuse to what is really going on. Yeah, crimes that have been already adjudicated. While I can't talk about the cases that haven't gone to court, we can talk about the ones that have. And I hope by this time, you'll know that we have the court of public opinion to lean to. Yeah, we might have opinions, but it comes down to what's the basis and the principles of our law, common sense. We want to get it back to common sense where you can talk to people. You can go to the sporting event. You can have fun again. You don't have to be afraid of these issues. Some people, they haven't quite healed. I know my family is still recovering from a lot of things, and that my family, of all families, have been wounded the most. by many of these situations, because we got to acknowledge our families have lost something in this. And that mother on mommypage.com, I acknowledge what you're going through, and I'm concerned for her, the mom. As much as the children, I'm concerned about the mom. Because, imagine a mother whose world is changed by that. To me, I try to imagine what it's like to be that mother. And it just, that's why I do what we do. And that's why I want us to be a part of this. We're committed to reaching out to our neighbors next door to us, to the guy that works across the street at the gas station. For me, that's why we do it. So I'm going to leave it there where I started. While we might not be born with all these amazing abilities, and I wish I could say I was, maybe we were. I just know this. If you have a way to use your gifts and your talents to reach out to those people and talk about this, you're going to reach, that reach is going to be incredible. And I hope you do. That's my main concern. Who cares about status and all those things? Those things don't matter. But if you, again, use it for a right reason, just like technology, if technology left in the wrong hands, it could be very bad. Technology in the good hands, it could be very useful. If you have the ability to open up to people around you, offer a way that people can meet in the park and talk about these concerns. To me, it starts in the park. It starts in your church. It starts at the podium. It starts just me and you talking. Nobody needs a soapbox for this. Okay, I'm only doing it this way because I know it works, and I know because this is about us volunteering, and I know a community heals when people volunteer. It works every time. I'm telling you, I'm giving away the answers. This works. When people reach out to one another, it works. So with that said, I want to thank you for giving me this time to listen to me about this concern I have and addressing it not only from the legal standpoint, but as a member of the community. Because to me, this is everyone's concern. If you have children and you love them, I wouldn't be surprised if you would want to know more. That's why I list all the other additional information below at the YouTube channel in the description box below. Thank you for your time on this very important matter and this community outreach for the Blue Ribbon Campaign. Thank you.